Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. Max Gaines, son of Jewish immigrants, changed his name from Ginzburg. He was a bit of a jack of all trades. And one day in 1933, he started a new job as a newspaper salesman, and he knew that the Sunday comics sold papers. So he took a section, folded it over again, stapled it, and created the American comic book of that as we know it, as a comic book sized collection of reprints of newspaper comics. And it started as a promotion and became the first comic book. He would team up with two other sons of immigrant Jews. One, Jack Leibowitz on the right, was a salesman, and Harry Donenfeld worked for independent news distributors. And together they would team up with Max Gaines and buy out a publisher who had started publishing comics in 1935 of new material after reprints of comic strips had basically run out. Once they acquired New Fun Comics, New Fun became New Adventure. And this was really the first look at what became the empire of DC Comics, which is the same story that we're going to tell as the Jews who invented Hollywood. Jack Warner, these are all sons of immigrant Jews or immigrant Jews themselves. Samuel Goldwyn, Louis B. Mayer. Detective Comics was their first comic book of new material based on a single theme. And then came what's called the Ashcan edition of Action Comics, a new title in 1938. They needed material for it. Sheldon Mayer, another great Jew in comics, looked through the slush pile and he found this quirky strip called Superman as a daily comic strip. But he was intrigued by the secret identity aspect. It reminded him of Zorro and the Scarlet Pimpernel. And it was a reflection of the Jewish creators themselves. Two 18-year-old kids from Cleveland, writer Jerry Siegel and artist Joe Shuster. So Mayer was able to sell the concept to Max Gaines, and Shuster went to work on cutting up the syndicated strip versions of Superman and pasting them up into what became the very first page in the very first issue of Action Comics in 1938. An overnight success, followed by, of course, Superman in his own title. You can see how they slightly revamped the origin about Superman being shot as Kal-El from Krypton exploding. When the vessel reached our planet, the child was found by a couple of Kents. Of course, many writers since have seen the analogy with the baby Moses floating down the River Nile and being rescued, and would become the somewhat superheroic savior of the Jewish people, shown here parting the Red Sea with his superpowers. Here is a modern version of Superman with an Egyptian background as well. Modern writers have written about the Jewish connection between Superman and his Jewish background. This writer, Jeff Salomon, this was, I think, 1992 in the Village Voice. He quoted from really the first Jewish writer himself to really discuss the Jewish connection to Superman's origin when he has this great quote. It wasn't Krypton that Superman came from. It was the planet Minsk or Lutz or Vilna or Warsaw. Pfeiffer wrote in his essay in this book, which was the first comic book history book in 1965. But it was a collection of the reprints of all the early superheroes with his great essays. And he went on to say, Superman was the ultimate assimilationist fantasy. And that's why in the modern era, since the year 2000, we've gotten a slew of books of the relationship between Jews and comics. Without Pfeiffer's original essay, Ari Kaplan never would have titled this From Krakow to Krypton. Up, up, and oy vey. Yes, I kid you not. How Jewish history, culture, and values shaped the comic book superhero by Simcha Weinstein. Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, comics, and the creation of the superhero by Danny Fingeroth. Superman is Jewish. How comic book superheroes came to serve truth, justice, and the Jewish American way by Harry Broad. Superman Circumcised, the complete Jewish history of the world's greatest hero by Roy Schwartz is brand new and just came out. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, I want to welcome you to my take on this whole question of Jews and comics. And I call it a past and present history. Of course, sharp eyes will note that I totally base my type treatment on the great lettering by Action Comics here, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But what I mean by a past and present history is that when you look at the past in Jewish history, the idea of heroes, somewhat with superpowers, like David being able to beat Goliath. And then, years later, we have the story of Samson in his chains here, blinded, but pushing down the columns on his oppressors. Superman, always from the start, was pictured as breaking chains and representing the chains of oppression and foreign domination. Judah Maccabee, another great Jewish warrior, 165 BC, after a 25-year somewhat guerrilla war, was able to defeat the larger, the Assyrians, I believe, from desecrating the temple in Jerusalem. And that's where we get the story of Hanukkah. Then, of course, 200 years later or so, we get the tragic yet heroic story of Masada in 70 AD, the remaining Jews in the Jewish-Roman wars, after they had totally destroyed Jerusalem and murdered hundreds of thousands of people. The last remaining Jews held off the Romans for 3 or 4 years, I think from 66 to 70, or maybe, I'm not sure the exact dates, but they were great warriors. Then you have in the year 115 AD, the story of Bar Kokhba, who was considered by one of the leading Jewish rabbis and sages of the time, Rabbi Akiva, who we read about in Passover. He declared Bar Kokhba the Messiah, and they led the second Jewish revolt, which was, of course, wiped out by the Romans and Bar Kokhba was murdered. This is actually the cover of a piece of sheet music for probably a Yiddish opera in the 19th century. So flash forward from 115 AD, we get to the 17th century in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and we have the Jewish rabbi, and this is as the legend would have it, but the rabbi existed, of course, Rabbi Love, spelled L-O-E-W, but pronounced Lev. And there were so many pogroms, which were the anti-Jewish riots allowed by the state of Christian marauders, that usually around sacred Christian festivals like Easter and other things, they would raid Jewish villages. If you've seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, there's a great filming of a pogrom. But they were the original modern anti-Jewish riots that the Nazis would learn from hundreds of years later. But in order to protect the Jews of the pogrom, Rabbi Love read in the Kabbalah that he could bring inanimate clay to life, and that's where we get the word Golem from. which means raw material of which Adam was created from the shapeless mass. Golem is probably the exact Hebrew word. In the Mishnah, a golem is referred to as an uncultivated person, but here is a painting of Rabbi Lev with his golem, and by inscribing the word emet on his forehead and saying a Jewish incantation, emet means truth in English, and that brought the golem to life. And at first it did protect the Jews of the ghetto, but unfortunately, without having a mind or a heart, it just was a life force. It started killing everybody, not just the non-Jews. So Rabbi Lev eventually had to put it down. And by taking the letter E, the part of emet, you're left with the word met on his forehead, which means death. And according to legend, the golem is still stored up in that famous synagogue in Prague. If you've seen, what was that movie Soderbergh made about, I think it was called Kafka with Jeremy Irons. Great. It was shot in Prague, and many shots of that synagogue, probably maybe filmed in it. But if the story sounds familiar, 200 years later, what was it, 1818, 1813? Yes, Mary Shelley writes the story of Frankenstein, about a scientist who creates life out of inanimate material. Sound familiar? You know, in every examination of Frankenstein, I've never really come across anybody that said the golem legend had been around for 200 years in Europe. So, you know, the idea that educated people like Mary Shelley and her cronies there, Pierce and, you know, Byron and whatever, would not be aware of the golem legend. But again, out of the golem legend, it was made into a 1920 German film, silent film. And of course, 11 years later, we get the modern golem of the monster, the American monster film, First Frankenstein with Boris Karloff. So the idea of a monster with no soul walking in the earth was happening in the 1930s in the form of this guy and committing atrocities that look like this, which in a metaphysical, more kind of universal way, these ideas were in the ether. People didn't know the extreme of what was happening, but it cast the 1933/1938 version of the Superman legend in a different light of world events that were happening that Jews like Jerry Siegel and Shuster sensed and were aware of. So here's Superman, champion of the oppressed, the physical marvel who had sworn to devote his existence to helping those in need, summoned, as it were, by Siegel. Now, the story has it, of course, we're going to talk about that in a second, but, you know, because stuff like this was going on, whether people knew it or not on a large scale, cast stories that Siegel wrote. This was in the very first issue of Superman in 1939, before America enters the war. What a title, Superman Champions Universal Peace. And basically Superman's idea of bringing peace in Europe was to threaten physical violence. He'll smash the remaining pillar, bringing the entire roof down on you. Talk about Samson. And in another story, I don't know if this is the same story, but doesn't really matter. What do you want with us? Now, at the time, these are, of course, generic European dictators. They weren't pictured as Hitler, Mussolini, or Stalin, because you got to remember, all three were sovereign heads of state in the 1930s and given that level of respect. But Superman is so popular in his first 2 years that in the February 27th, 1940 issue of Look magazine, which was the kind of, Avis to Life magazine's Hertz, they actually hired Siegel and Shuster to write and draw this 2-page, oddly two-colored piece. Why they couldn't do it in full color, I don't know. But you can see it's the answer to what Siegel and Shuster felt they were being berated with, was what would Superman do, with the war if he got involved? And as you can glean from these 2 pages, he takes matters into his own hands. And now it's no longer a generic dictator. Look at this, right? So 2 months later, an article appeared in the April 1940 issue of the SS newspaper Das Schwarzkorps, which is the Black Corps. The SS feature objected to Superman's attacking Hitler. And it attacked, of course, Siegel for being Jewish and condemned the character for, quote, exploiting the idealistic aspirations of American children, appealing to them with cries of strength, courage, justice. But instead, he sows hatred, discord, injustice, laziness, and criminality in young hearts, unquote. Boy, that sounds like what the 1950s attackers of comic books said about comic books. But what he mostly objected to, this German author, was that an American Jew was making money by merchandising a debased form of a German concept, which was, of course, alluding to the Übermensch by Friedrich Nietzsche. But yes, once the war started, Superman would fight a proxy war on comic book covers. And look at Siegel and Shuster here, looking a lot more successful than when they walked into DC years before. And they were, I think, on salary, and they had to open up a whole studio of artists. So at that time, another young cartoonist at DC Comics was checking out how much money these guys were making, and said to his editor, what do I got to do to make the money Siegel and Shuster making? And the editor, Vince Sullivan by name, said to 21-year-old, I think he was, Bob Kane, changed his name from Kahan, next in our line of Jews in comics. He had a writing partner, Milton Finger, changed his name to Bill. And together they would create, yes, Batman, appearing a year after Superman. There's the classic issue, Detective 27, followed a year later by the introduction of the boy wonder, Robin, who's actually a creation, not really of Kane, but of Kane's first ghost artist, young Jerry Robinson. Jerry Robinson would become a legend in comics and cartooning. This is the book that came out a couple of years before he passed away a couple of years ago. And yes, as Bob Kane's assistant, uncredited, he not only drew for Bob Kane, inked Bob Kane, penciled for Bob Kane, but also without his involvement, there would be no Robin, there would be no Joker. And even though Bob Kane for decades claimed he created those characters, all the forensic evidence points heavily to both Robinson. Really, you got to give Robinson, Bill Finger, and Bob Kane. It's a triptych of creators in all of these early Batman things. But so successful was Robin's introduction that a year later, I mean, that same year, 1940, there was Batman's first issue. And it reprinted the origin, which has become like the Stations of the Cross. We all know it, right? His parents get killed by a anonymous gangster in this first story. Now, again, like the Stations of the Cross, that was the origin of Batman. Now, what's interesting is that not only was there a lot of street crime in the 1930s because of the Depression, but it was only revealed a couple of years ago by a great researcher, Mark Nobleman, that Jerry Siegel's father died in a holdup, not from a gunshot, but the stress on his heart after the criminals left. And I think he died in 1931, maybe 2 years before Siegel, supposedly in the middle of a hot night, can't sleep, knows that up in the clouds there's cool air. And he thinks, if only I could be up in those clouds. And out of the seed of that thought came Superman. He was so excited by the concept, he jotted it all down. I think ran to Joe Shuster's house like first thing in the morning and had him start drawing this character. Well, that's supposedly Siegel's story. And yet, when you learn that Bill Finger might have been aware that that's how Siegel's father died, which, by the way, so yeah, 2 years later, 1933, he creates the ultimate father figure to come down to earth. So that's one way of looking at the origin of Batman through Siegel's experience, which again was kept quiet for decades until only, maybe 10 years ago or so. So New York City was a small comics community in the 30s. All these young Jews, because you got to remember, newspapers were a higher echelon. Jews weren't allowed in the higher echelon jobs, but young Jews like Jaime Simon on the left, writer artist, changed his name to Joe. And that would be Yaakov Kurtzberg on the right, changed his name to Jack Kirby. You see, some Jews changed their names, some Jews didn't. They were young writer artists working together as a team. Speaking of team, the thing they're working on for DC Comics is the genre that they co-created of boy gangs, which was a reflection, of course, what was happening in the movie serials at the time. But as two young American Jews, they were aware of the rising tide of Hitler, especially by 1939 after the war started. But remember, America wasn't in the war. So here we are in the spring of 1941, and Simon and Kirby create this guy in response. This is actually Joe Simon's drawing, not Jack Kirby, but Jack Kirby would become associated with the art right from the very start. But it is definitely a co-creation. Notice the triangular shield. This is, of course, page one. I just want to add, I forgot to mute everybody. So if you can just be quiet, who's ever listening in. Anyway, I just realized because I just heard something. So to continue, this was the splash page, of course, to Captain America #1, which appeared in early 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, to try to elevate America's consciousness to what was happening in the war. And in the very first issue, look at this call to action for young American youth that was reading comic books by the millions at that time. Of course, Captain America Wanting You is a reflection of what Captain America is, a 20th century superheroic version of James Montgomery Flagg's classic Uncle Sam. But I think Uncle Sam was around way before this. He comes out of the 19th century. I like this piece of art I found on the internet that recalls the very first Marvel Captain America film, which had the scene where he stumps for war bonds. That's how popular, but this is based on truth. That's how popular Captain America was, that they dress up an actor and, stump for war bonds. Captain America was so popular in the early 40s, he was one of the early superhero black and white serials. And yes, there it is. The the early 40s example of superheroic musculature, right? Now, I'd like to think this classic photo is the first cosplay from Captain America #2, the issue that this kid is holding. Somebody said it's from a 1964 or 5 comic convention, but like I said, I'd like to think it's based on this issue that he's holding, another. But yeah, Captain America was such an overnight success, like Superman, that it immediately spawned imitators, names like Captain Battle, Minuteman, and then, of course, the characters over at DC. Everybody started fighting the war, at least on their comic covers. Without Captain America, you would have seen none of this. Look at Wonder Woman fighting the Japanazi rats, as they were called. Over at rival Timely Comics, they weren't called Marvel until the 1960s, but their flagship heroes were the Human Torch. This is the first version of the Human Torch when he's an android, not a human being, and Bill Everett's classic Submariner character. So everybody's fighting the war. Even Uncle Sam is a comic character now, fighting alongside Captain Marvel. Uncle Sam is so popular, he gets his own title. Now, the guy who created Uncle Sam was the same writer-artist who created Blackhawk, the military comic book characters, which were very popular at the dawn of World War II. And that writer-artist would be another great Jew in comics, Will Eisner, one of the American Jews that didn't change his name. His father was from the old country, I think from Austria, where he was a painter of, I think, palaces, interiors. And Eisner, as a kid, worked designing, or maybe his father, when he came here, designed stage plays for the Yiddish theater on Lower 2nd Avenue in New York City. You can see Eisner, like a lot of young cartoonists in the 1930s, wanted to be a newspaper syndicated strip because that's where the money was. Comic books were just brand new and were fledgling. But one of the things he did create at the dawn of comics, May 1939, same month as Batman, is Wonder Man. Now, you can see he's plainly jumping across rooftops, stopping a plane. Yet, DC Comics sued the publisher, saying that Wonder Man was a carbon copy of their character, Superman. And guess what? They won. And it soured Will Eisner on superheroes right from the get-go. So when the great newspaper syndicate, the Des Moines Register that worked with the Des Moines Register and Tribune, offered Eisner in 1940 the chance to be the editor and artist and writer and packager of a 16-page comic book that would be inserted into all of their newspapers. For Eisner, this was a brilliant opportunity. It's more of an adult audience, and he would own his own character. This was like the first guy that owned his material. They wanted a superhero, so Eisner put a mask on his detective character. That's how sick of superheroes he was. And that's why his character, the Spirit, has a mask. Look at how he first looks in June of 1940 when he appears. And then 9 years later, you get the mature Eisner at the peak of his illustrative powers, giving you this character. He's called the Spirit because he's a detective who everybody thinks is dead. So he's using his anonymity to fight crime so nobody can get to him, hence his secret identity. But artistically, what the Spirit is revered for are Eisner's incredible use of the comic book medium itself, the page-turning, storytelling, graphic medium. And it started with these incredible splash pages. Now, if you're thinking, wow, this feels like a film, Eisner's Spirit is the closest thing to film noir on paper. This is happening during the 1940s as film noir was happening. But Eisner had no peer graphically. Nobody else was doing stuff like this. Notice you can see the Spirit logo and the letters descending down into the subway. Here's another classic. But again, the Spirit doesn't have superpowers. The stories of the Spirit, seven pages, yeah, 7-page stories were incredibly written, the equivalent of short stories. And more often than not, as a great writer in the Jewish tradition of writing about the little guy, the individual, that's what so many of the greatest Spirit stories are about. They're not really about the Spirit character. They're about schlubs, guys like this, Freddie, a 2-bit thug that Eisner tells the story of the last 10 minutes of this schnook's life. And like I said, Eisner's stories about these little slices and vignettes of the foibles and tragedies of modern life are really the comic book equivalent of the stories of Shalom Aleichem, like this one, Mashkela the thief. You get the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer, shown here with a great cover by Milton Glaser, showing the Jewishness of his stories. And you get that in Eisner's Spirit, especially the story of Gerhard Schnabel. Look at how Eisner begins it. Looks like a schnook, looks like a Buster Keaton type character flying. Well, here's the black and white reprint. It's actually better than any colored version I could find. But it's not a good day for Gerhard Schnabel. He gets fired. I think his wife leaves him. He's got nothing left to live for, but all he wants to do is fly since he was a kid. And notice in the middle right panel, as the Spirit is kind of in the background fighting crime, there's a big crowd below. They'll see me and I'll be famous. Boy, sound very modern to you? The idea of risking your life for fame. And then you get one of the great Eisner panels. This one. Folks, there's cartooning at its greatest. Remember, as Robert Crumb would say, it's just lines on paper. So look at the lines of the buildings. They're abstract, yet that feels very realistic. The character is drawn in a somewhat cartoony manner, yet Eisner's mastery of folds and fabric and clothing and the cartooniness of it mixed with the realism is Eisner's hallmark. You turn the page and he draws Gerhard Schnabel as a child. I think this is the first use of photography in modern comic book art. I've talked to a lot of comic book historians about this. And yeah, I think this is really the first one before anybody else. Notice his use of the captions fluttering to give you the feeling, the reader, that type is alive. Another great Jew is Abe Kannigsen, Eisner's letterer. But he was following Eisner's graphic direction. And yeah, so there he is. Hey, look at me, I'm flying. And instead of falling, he flew gracefully to earth. And as Gerhard Schnabel flies by, he says, gee, it's wonderful, I'm flying, but no one's noticing. And look what happens. As he flies around, you turn the page and he gets hit in a kind of a flyby shooting. And so lifeless Gerhard Schnabel fluttered earthward. But do not weep for Schnabel. Rather shed a tear for all mankind. For not one person in the entire crowd that watched his body being carted away knew or even suspected that on this day, Gerhard Schnabel had flown. The year this appeared, 1948, was the same year that, remember our old friend Max Gaines, died in a boating accident. Now, Max Gaines had been publishing all through the 1940s, framed on the wall there, picture stories from the Bible. It began with Old Testament translations in comic book form, and these are very successful. He also did New Testament versions as well. He expanded his own publishing empire apart from DC Comics, called it EC Comics, which stood for Educational Comics. Well, everything was going smoothly till the boating accident, and that left his son on the left, Bill Gaines. And yes, you're getting ahead of me if you know that name is familiar. With his Jewish writer, artist, partner, editor as well, Al Feldstein. And together, they took over the company and they changed it from educational comics to entertaining comics. And what did they entertain people with? Horror comics. And this is where at the dawn of the end of the 40s into the 50s, the EC horror comics were the most infamous as well as famous. They had crime suspense stories. Yes, that is a pretty intense cover. To comic book purists, it was their science fiction line with great artists. I mean, all the artists for their books, the horror stories as well. This is the great Wally Wood, if you know the artist, Wally Wood. Weird Science was one of their science fiction titles, and the other one was Weird Fantasy. There's a cover by Al Feldstein. In Weird Fantasy, I believe in 1953, at the end of EC Comics' existence, one of the last stories they published was called Judgment Day. And it's all about an emissary from Earth in the red suit that comes to a planet peopled by robots, orange robots, as you can see here. Actually, they're probably gold, but they describe them as orange robots in the actual text. And they're seeking admission into the Federation. Sound familiar? The robot planet is. And the Earth investigator has come to check out their society and see if they're ready for it. Well, turns out that the orange robots enslave the blue robots. The blue robots do all the work for the orange robots. So as you can see here, look at what he says here. Is there hope for us, Tarleton? Of course there is. Of course there's hope for you, my friend. For a while on Earth, it looked like there was no hope. But when mankind on Earth learned to live together, real progress first began. The universe was suddenly ours. And when we learn to live together, the universe will be yours too. Goodbye, my friend. And as he takes off into the night sky, it roared into the infinite void of space. Into the endless cosmic vacuum. It roared toward glorious Earth. And then we get to the final panel. Inside the ship, the man removed his space helmet and shook his head. And the instrument lights made the beads of perspiration on his dark skin twinkle like distant stars. This might be the first realistically drawn by the great artist, future editor of DC Comics, Joe Orlando. But really one of the first realistic depictions of a Black man in American comics. And in a story written by Jews in the early 50s, this is way before the civil rights movement even begins, shows you how forward thinking and how Jewish in the ideals of freedom and justice Gaines and Feldstein embodied. They did stories about drug abuse. They did stories and shock suspense stories about bigotry. In the early 50s, the anti-communist era, McCarthy era, that dialogue, of course, could be taken from any one of the Trump rallies of the last 5 years. How about this take on the Ku Klux Klan? Again, folks, remember, this is early 1950s. Nobody was doing this anywhere, in movies, on television. Perhaps the epitome of the EC Jewish-infused approach was one of their last publications. You know, they were eventually hounded out by the anti-comic book forces. That's a whole nother story. But one of their last titles, I think this is April 1950. I'm going to say 54. I don't think it could be 55. And in a cover by Jack Davis, you see a man in the subway running away from a sinister-looking man in black. Well, it turns out to be the story Master Race, written by Feldstein and Gaines, but illustrated by one of the great Jews in comics, Bernard Krigstein, an artist who would really experiment with the panel to panel when they talk about comics as film on paper. Krigstein, coming a couple of years after Eisner, is really the next guy after Eisner to take the idea of comics as film on paper and using this incredible story about a Holocaust survivor who sees his ex-commandant on the subway. And eventually the man chases, backs into the subway train in the tracks. But in incredible panels like this, you can see Krigstein doing a very stylized version of the photographs that post-war seeped out into the culture about the reality of the concentration camps. But this is the early 50s during the Korean War. And while EC Comics is riding high, they decided to do war comics. And they let one of their writer, artist, editors, Harvey Kurtzman, our next great Jew in comics, to handle this new EC war comic line. Well, war comics at that time, dating back to World War II, were all pro-war, portraying the heroic American soldier. Well, Kurtzman, as the humanist liberal Jew that he was, wanted nothing to do with pro-war comics. He creates the first truly anti-war war comics, appearing right during the Korean War. And this is Kurtzman. Not only did he write the stories and lay them out for his artists to illustrate, but he often illustrated the covers and illustrated some stories himself. But you can see in the raw savagery of the bullet hole right through the helmet of the soldier on the right, grasping for life itself in the dirt. Kurtzman, you could be called a cartoony artist, but I love when he drew real life, but yet still was a cartoonist at heart. So you get this great dichotomy, this tension in Kurtzman's work between the realism and the cartooniness, which really is one of the beautiful things about comic book art. You can see how different Kurtzman's books were from the heroic image of the soldier being portrayed at the very same time as Kurtzman is doing his two titles, Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat. And you can see that some of the stories were what was happening in Korea at the time. And when Kurtzman didn't do the illustrating, you can see how he took the great Jack Davis from the horror line. And by having him illustrate war, you got the horror of war. This is not your sanitized American soldier. It's a monstrous Jack Davis American soldier. But it was the stories that Kurtzman told in Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat, especially the ones he illustrated himself,
that really get across that Jewish point of view of the individual in a world full of tragedy and some triumph. This classic story called If is all about a soldier sitting by the side of the road, dying of a shrapnel wound, and recalling the events of just the past, his life, as his life flashes before him. And he just keeps saying, if I hadn't taken this road, and he keeps backing up, if I hadn't joined the army, if I hadn't, and he keeps going back, if I hadn't even been born. But Kurtzman also had a comedic side, like a yin yang, which would result in one of the greatest American pop culture creations of the 20th century. Yes, Mad. It wasn't called Mad Magazine back then because it was a comic book. And it starts out doing parodies of other comics. Here's the first real Superman parody by the great Wally Wood, of course. And out of these, look, they did Mickey Mouse. I mean, they were the first to skewer these beloved American traditions. But the Jew in Kurtzman also inserted a lot of Yiddishisms. Ganef means thief. And even expressions like patrazibi, as some people thought it was pronounced, was really a Polish word, potrevia. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. But here's one of the great Mad Magazine covers, illustrated by the classic illustrator Basil Wolverton. You can see that Kurtzman was doing a total satire on the Life magazine of the day. But this cover literally freaked out an entire generation of kids who a decade or so later would become the avatars of underground comics. Most prominently shown here would be Robert Crumb. He describes first viewing that cover and like something went off, an explosion in his mind, which again would eventually turn into underground comics. Kurtzman would later, when EC was being killed by the censors, would escape with Mad by turning it into a magazine versus a comic book. And of course, after a year or so of its success, he had a falling out with Bill Gaines over ownership of Mad, and he left and never returned. But Mad would go on with Al Feldstein as the editor to even greater heights. So here we are in the middle of the 1950s, a decade known for speed, like the car, outer space, where we want to go. Beautiful graphics, right? Well, somebody up at DC Comics, circa 1955, decided, nobody's been publishing superheroes since, the end of the 1940s. The last issue of The Flash was in 1951. Here's the first appearance from 1940. And we still don't know to this day, but somebody said, why don't we bring The Flash back? Except not as the same character, but as a new Flash, same powers of super speed, but with a whole new identity, a whole new story. If that sounds familiar to modern audience members, that's because it sounds like a reboot. But yes, this was the first pop culture American reboot, appearing in 1956 in the summer, dated October, in DC Comics' tryout title called Showcase, where every issue or so they would alternate a different feature. If it sold well, they would get its own comic. And so The Flash did indeed sell well. Illustrated and co-created by the great artist Carmine Infantino, obviously not Jewish, but the editor of The Flash, who was put in charge of the project to bring The Flash back in a new costume and new identity, was another in our great line of Jews in comics. and that would be editor Julius Schwartz. Now, Julius Schwartz came out of a science fiction background, editing science fiction fanzines in the early 30s. So he was a pulp magazine editor, but he would team with young artists, eventually looking like this. That would be Gil Kane, but in the early 40s, he was known by his original name, Eli Katz. So yes, another great Jew in comics. After the success of The Flash, Gil Kane would create the character Green Lantern. Here's the first issue appearing in the summer of 1959. Now, Green Lantern was another rebooted character from the 1940s. And look at the difference in costume design between the 1940 Green Lantern, very baggy suited with the magician's type cloak, and the skin tight outfit of Gil Kane for this new decade of the 1960s. By the way, the early 40s superheroes, I don't have time to credit all the Jews in comics, but Martin Nodell created Green Lantern with writer Bill Finger. So they brought back the Golden Age Green Lantern in the new Green Lantern comic. And Gil Kane, for the Green Lantern stories, created these giant blue-skinned, ball-headed wise men called the Guardians of the Galaxy, or Guardians of the Universe. The Marvel Comics is Guardians of the Galaxy. But they were the wise, that's why they've got the big brains and the big heads. Artist Gil Kane said he patterned them after one of the great Jews of modern time, one of the founders of the state of Israel, and that would be David Ben Gurion. And you can see where Kane might have gotten his inspiration. Kane also creates next DC's Silver Age version of the Atom, shown here in his civilian identity of Ray Palmer. Notice none of the characters have Jewish names. They all have very Gentile names, starting with Clark Kent, of course. But here he is in his Gil Kane skin-tight outfit design. Look at the 1940s character. He was like a little guy that was like super strong or something, but he didn't really have superpowers, but he was called the Mighty Might. But anyway, just like the 1940s DC characters banded together to form the Justice Society, so too did Julius Schwartz bring all of his superheroes together, along with the ones that were holdovers from the 40s, like Wonder Woman. Martian Manhunter, down left, was created in 1955, a year before The Flash. Aquaman was created in 1940 and hung around. So there's a very rare picture of Julius Schwartz in the early 60s. His counterpart at rival Marvel Comics, at that time it was called Atlas, after it was called Timely in the 1940s. But there is Stanley Lieber, the next in our great American Jews in comics, changed his name to Stan Lee. And he was a writer and an editor who had been in the comic book business since the early 40s. When he was, I think, 18, he broke in. I think he went to the same high school, DeWitt Clinton, as Eisner and Bob Kane and Bill Finger. Like, they all came out of that high school. But anywho, I digress. He teams up with, remember Yaakov Kurtzberg, aka Jack Kirby? Well, by the late 50s, after breaking up with Joe Simon, he winds up, after doing a bunch of other things, which I do a whole nother webinar about, teaming up with Stan Lee in the late 50s, doing a bunch of monster comics. But after the success of Justice League of America, they're given the mandate to come up with a knockoff title. And yes, in the summer of 1961, we get the birth of modern Marvel Comics with the debut issue of Task Force. And remember, I told you, Kirby had been doing monster comics. So the idea of a giant monster menacing the Fantastic Four, yet you could also not avoid the similarity to the giant monster fighting the miniature heroes on this classic cover. But again, I digress. What made the Fantastic Four unique, as you see here in the last panel, was the character, the Thing. he was literally like a monster left over from Kirby's monster years, but he's also the hero. And you could see in his early clayish appearance, he of course resembles the Golem that we talked about before. Here's a statue in Prague to the modern statue of the Golem. And you can see that Kirby's thing is, you could even say Golem-like, you know? But Kirby identified most with the thing. Whenever he would do a self-portrait, he drew himself as the thing. In fact, he said, the way the thing talks and acts, you'll find that he is really Jack Kirby. He has my manners. He has my manner of speech. He thinks the way I do. He's excitable, very active among people, and he can muscle his way through a crowd. I'm that sort of person. But you can see here in this Hanukkah card that surfaced on the net years ago, that Kirby never denied the Jewishness of the thing, even though it's only recently Marvel Comics has kind of come out and officially made him Jewish. But that's the idea of Jews in comics, was that mostly created by Jews, but again, the Jewishness was never overt. But in recent years on the internet, I see art like this. It's davening time. For you non-Jews, davening is the Yiddish word or the Hebrew word for praying. When pious Jews pray, they kind of rock back and forth, and that's called davening. And there's the thing wearing his prayer shawl called a tallis. But yes, davening time is based on the Kirbyism. It's clobbering time. That became the catchphrase of Ben Grimm. But check out this great Kirby story. And by the way, I believe these are Kirby's stories that Stan Lee wrote the dialogue and all the editorial matter. And I don't want to get into a whole digression there, which, believe me, is a digression. But in the summer of 1963, you get the 21st issue of the Fantastic Four featuring a character called the Hate Monger. Now, obviously, you can tell right away, Kirby's basing him on the pointed hoods of the Ku Klux Klan, who in the early 60s, during the early years of the Civil Rights Movement, pictures like this would appear in Life magazine or on television that Kirby would see. So again, this is Kirby's story, but that's Stan Lee's actual dialogue. Kirby would draw his stories out. What? Please, I'm trying not to talk because I forgot to mute everybody and I'm recording. So, but anyway, yeah. So it's Lee's writing over Kirby's, kind of like a silent movie on paper. But yeah, if you read this dialogue, it sounds like it could have been taken from a Trump rally. And we finally, at the end of the story, unmask the hate monger. And who is he? But yes, he's Adolf Hitler, the most evil human being the world has ever known. So yeah, it's interesting that a month or so after this issue appeared, the hate monger struck and then killed Kennedy. And that's why Kirby, who loved Kennedy like so many Americans did at the time, felt that he needed to bring back Captain America to be a kind of a proxy fill-in for John Kennedy. And that's why Captain America reappears in this issue of the Avengers, appearing in early 1964 as a proxy replacement for Kennedy. Now, Kirby, of course, creates all the Marvel character foundations with the exception of, well, he had a hand in Spider-Man, but that's a whole different story. But take Thor, for instance. Look at how he starts out in 1962. He was supposed to be Marvel's version of Superman. That's why you have the red, yellow, and blue primary colors. Kirby, of course, based him on the Norse god stories that his parents, Austrian Jews, I believe, would tell him as a child. And that's why a couple of years after Thor's debut, by 1965, Kirby's mature style, blockier, bolder, has developed, and he takes Thor off of Earth and puts him on Asgard and begins telling these incredibly mythic stories, and the art matches the myth. Look at this incredible 1965 cover. And yes, if it reminds you of Samson, it should. This is actually a Norman Rockwell, and it looks like the actor Victor Mature, who at the time was playing Samson and Delilah. And perhaps Kirby was just as influenced by the movie at the time to draw this incredible image. But for a clue to the Jewishness in Kirby's Thor, let's jump to 1968. Kirby, in his prime, has Thor facing off against one of his most fierce villains, the awful, evil Mangog. And Mangog is set out to destroy the whole universe and bring on the end of the world called Ragnarok. Their idea, the Norse gods' version of Armageddon. Now, where did Kirby get Mangog from? Well, in Jewish apocryphal lore, Gog and Magog are the two evil beings. Maybe they're demigods. I'm not sure if maybe they're God, but they're supposed to, in the Battle of Armageddon, lead the armies from, you can see, Europe and Asia to converge with their Arab allies at the Battle of Armageddon. Now, that's the ancient lore, but what was happening in Kirby's life like this? Yeah, World War II and the Nazi takeover. So when you read this incredible 3-issue saga, which to me is the height of Thor, because Ragnarok was always talked about by Kirby and Thor, but he finally takes us to the brink of it. But it's really, you know, I would say the most Jewish of his stories, because it has a direct parallel to the real Mangog, who is Adolf Hitler, that Kirby himself fought in World War II. He actually fought for Patton. And look at this book called Patton's Panthers. There was a segregated African-American division of expert tank fighters, and they were known as the Black Panthers, or at least that was their logo. So it's interesting that years later, Kirby, who fought with Patton, would create in early 1966. Hey, who's ever speaking in the background, can you please keep it down, because I'm recording. And I didn't mute everybody, so I forgot to mute. So we're picking up all the volume. Anywho, but yes, the Black Panther, you know, there's talk, oh, Stan Lee created the Black Panther. No, it was Jack Kirby. Now, the Black Panther political party was created 6 months after this came out in October of 1966. Here's their button. And they claim they got the name from a 1964 Alabama voting rights organization that got the symbol from Georgia, Clark Atlanta University. Their sports team is called the Panthers. And they chose the Black Panther to offset the white supremacist symbol that you can see here with the rooster on the right. So Jack Kirby was an autodidact. He was a polymath. He read and was aware of headlines like those in 1964, when 2 Jews, along with the Black James Chaney, were murdered in Mississippi, which was a watershed in the civil rights movement, galvanizing so many people, including, I'm sure, Kirby. I'm sure Kirby was aware in 65 of the first major Black riots in America, the Watts riots in Los Angeles. And that's why sometime in 1965, this picture was actually taken probably in November of 65, maybe, right around the time that he would later say in an interview, I came up with the Black Panther because I suddenly discovered that I had a lot of black readers, and here I am, a leading cartoonist, and I wasn't doing a black man. So this sketch survives that Kirby did sometime in 1965 of his original idea for the Black Panther. He wasn't even called the Black Panther. He was called the Coal Tiger, C-O-A-L. Now, maybe a Black Panther, coal is black, maybe that's how in Africa they would describe like a Black Panther as a coal tiger. But you can see that that was his costume for the first Black Marvel Comics superhero by Jack Kirby. Now, notice in this rejected cover of the debut issue of the Black, I don't know who's talking in the background, but can I please ask you to be quiet? I didn't mute everybody, and I'm recording this, and I'm picking up all the volume. Please try to be quiet for the conversation. That's the last time I'll do it, folks. I'm sorry. But yes, what do we see here on this rejected cover? But a half mask. Why was this not used? And this version of the Black Panther appears? Well, there's no paper trail, so we can only assume that Southern distributors would not, in 1966, put out a superhero black man. Interesting that Kirby creates this character a couple issues after he creates some other very Jewish-infused characters in the Fantastic Four title. Couple issues earlier, we have the character, the Watcher, who's heralding the coming of another character, Galactus. Now, the Watcher comes out of, again, Jewish and Christian Apocrypha, that they're these angelic beings that are sent merely to observe. Sound very Star Trek, right? What's the prime directive of not interfering? But the Watcher's prime mission by Kirby was to introduce, at the time, his most godlike character, Galactus, the devourer of worlds. Looks like a man, a giant man, but he's a god in a way. And Kirby said that he was looking for God and found him in Galactus. The apocryphal version is that Stan Lee, their editor and the guy that writes all the dialogue, called up Kirby one time in 1965 and said, hey, Jack, how about have the FF fight a really big villain? And Kirby goes into his basement studio in Long Island and comes up with the trilogy that became known as the Galactus trilogy. It's in these issues of Galactus's introduction. We also get the introduction of one of Kirby's graphic ideals, the imagery, the Kirby crackle, the dots you see down by his hands there, signifying cosmic energy. But it became known as the Galactus Silver Surfer trilogy because the very next issue is that a guy in a surfboard flying? Yes, it would be the introduction of the Silver Surfer. And Kirby would introduce him, influenced by the California Beach Boys craze that was sweeping America by the mid-60s. And he decides, you know, I'll put a guy on a surfboard surfing through space. But he gives the Silver Surfer a very tragic, very Jewish-inflected kind of story in the sense that he goes against his master's directive to destroy Earth. Oh, guys, who's ever talking in the background? You're killing me, man. But you can, okay, I don't want to stop recording and mute everybody. I'm going to keep going, but I wish who's ever talking in the background would please be quiet. But you can see that by going against his master's wishes, Galactus banishes him to no longer fly the spaceways with him, but be banished to Earth itself. Now, if this sounds familiar, yeah, it's the story of Satan, the fallen angel, for going up against God, for challenging God, for having pride, for having his individual ideas and thoughts and all the ways Satan's been interpreted. You have that in one of Kirby's greatest creations, The Silver Surfer. He would leave Marvel Comics in 1970 and create for them the next version of his gods after all the gods in Thor and Fantastic Four. That would be the new gods. Some people think this is Kirby's magnum opus, all the ideas and concepts he would unleash, but they all came out of the Old Testament. I mean, look at the High Father character, right out of, you know, the kind of biblical vision of God with the beard. And you can see that he communes with something called the source. And you can see that the source writes across the wall, a hand of flame. Notice Isaiah. These are all Kirby's, you know, word twists on classic Jewish Old Testament names of prophets like Isaiah. But the idea of the hand of fate writing across the wall also comes out of the Old Testament book of Daniel, in which I believe this is the son of Nebuchadnezzar, maybe, but he's told that if he doesn't repent, he will die by a hand that writes on the wall. Anyway, after his stint at DC in the 70s, he returns to Marvel in 1975-6 and gives them the next version of the new god, so to speak, is the Eternals. And you can see here in this double page spread, it looks very much like New Gods 2.0. But Kirby was obviously obsessed with the notion of gods vis-a-vis man. In the early 70s, he would produce portfolios. This was the cover of one of them, called The Gods. And in some of his greatest black and white illustrations of his entire career, dated 1970, are these God portfolio images, unlike anything Kirby ever drew, of his conception of God. Look at this one of God kind of observing this ball of confusion that is the earth, according to Kirby. But it's like every negative idea of earth as just this mass of hatred and evil and sin and etc. And how about this version of God literally turning his back on whether it's Earthmen or the people of that planet that obviously are both accusing God, rebelling against him, all the things you read about in the Old Testament about how you're not supposed to treat God. And you can see he's turned his back. Very different from this version of man and God that we all know and love. But the analogy to Michelangelo is not a tenuous one, as Kirby is considered the Michelangelo of comic book art and one of the greatest Jews of comics. Now, his kind of doppelgangers over at rival DC Comics, their most successful line was, of course, the Superman line. That was their #1 line. I mean, even secondary titles like Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane outsold every Marvel comic. And they were all under the leadership of our next great Jew in comics, Mort Weisinger, who was the editor of Superman from 1940 to 1970. But it was really, he had total control starting in the late 50s. He was one of the story editors on the Superman TV show. His artistic muse was the baby boomer Superman artist, Kurt Swan, who was the steady Superman artist for almost Weisinger's entire run from 1957 after Weisinger left to 1986. Maybe this is one of the great covers, penciled by Kurt Swan, that Superman statue, and done in black and white ink wash by another great Jew in comics, Jack Adler, the main color artist of DC Comics, the head of their coloring department. Howard Stern's uncle, I think, or cousin. And that's why Howard Stern's such a big comic book fan. He would bring him comic books as a child. By the way, this is my first comic book I can remember as a child. I was 5 years old in summer camp in 1963. But out of all the Weisinger stories and his editorship, and I think his kind of latent Jewish qualities found their way into a lot of these stories. So Superman's Day of Truth appearing in the early months of 1966, I believe, maybe 1965. I got to check my dates. But what was Superman's Day of Truth about? Well, you can see here it starts out where Superman's judging a baby contest, and he actually tells the woman that these kids are brats. How dare you? What rudeness. And look at Lois Lane, even she's outraged. Anyway, the same thing's happening with Supergirl. She's telling the bitter truth as they meet up later at the Supergirl fan club. Look at this little vignette. She's at a Supergirl fan club and they serve her fried chicken. And look how she says it wasn't. So, Superman and Supergirl rendezvousing at the Fortress of Solitude to explain to us, the readers, what's going on. So they shrink down and go into the bottle city of Kandor, and we're told this story. Long centuries ago, a ruthless swarm of alien invaders called Vrangs swept down upon our peaceful mother planet Krypton. And you can see that they're beast-like, almost kind of ape lizardy-like beings. And they enslave the Kryptonians. They're cruel. They give them meager rations. Treated us like beasts to humiliate us. But after years of slavery, one courageous youth defied the conquerors. Who are you, stripling? Why do you not smile like the others? Are you not happy to serve us? I will not lie. My name is Valor. I hate and despise you, Frangs. I wish you were all dead. And by standing up to the Vrangs, they shoot him dead. But he inspires as a martyr an uprising among the Kryptonians. They drove them from the planet. And as the elder ends his story, to honor the youth who sparked our revolt, a statue of Valor was set up in every city of old Krypton. As Kryptonians, we of Kandor honored his memory too. And you can see a day on which we speak nothing but the truth, just as Valor did. Now, within this story, I don't know who wrote it. He had a slew of writers. All of Weisinger's stories were stamped with his worldview. But this is a classic Old Testament Jewish story. It's the basic, rebelling of Egypt's cruelty. But it's every kind of Jewish story of oppression, which is why the Jews were able to identify with the Black Civil Rights Movement, because of their own history of oppression. But this story appearing in a comic book is veiled in Jewish lore, and yet, it's disguised in a kind of a generic tale. And that was the greatness of the Mort Weisinger Superman. Yeah, for every great story like that, there were like 25 dismissible pieces, but that's a whole nother story. Another thing I want to point out to you about this cover is that all of the hand lettering, which is beautiful, especially as seen on this full page house ad, as it's called, all of that lettering was done by another one of our great Jews in comics. One of the greatest hand letterers, I believe, of the 20th century. I mean, not only did this artist design the DC Comics logo, to me, the classic DC Comics logo, but he also designed the Comics Code stamp circa 1954. But what if I told you the same Jewish artist also designed the Roman letters, neither rain nor snow, nor heat, nor gloom of night shall stave off the postman from his appointed rounds. He also drew out the Roman letters on giant sheets of tracing paper that he would give to the stone carvers. What if I told you the same artist took Joe Shuster's crude telescopic Superman logo from the first issue in 1939 and gave it the iconic telescopic look that, in my opinion, is the Coca-Cola of comic book logos. And that would be Ira Schnapp. Ira Schnapp, the hand lettering calligraphic genius behind decades of the look of DC Comics. He came from Sasau, which is now part of Ukraine. I think back then it was part of Poland. I'm not sure when this map is drawn from, but there is maybe Sasov is the pronunciation. But his father was a stone carver. And look at, he had a coat of arms. So you can see where young Ira Schnapp, when they came to America as a teenager, he was able to draw those Roman letters. And then a couple decades later, working for DC Comics, would develop these iconic lettering styles that would have some of that old world charm, you could call it, but that very medieval, were perfect for titles like Viking Prince. But Schnapp's lettering was perfect for every title at DC Comics in the Silver Age. Look at this double-page spread of an unpublished monograph that I did about Ira Schnapp's work. So that's a double-page spread of as many logos as I could fit comfortably on a page that represent what I call Schnapp's greatest hits. But a quick scan will just show you the wealth of beautiful hand lettering suited to every title. Look at how the Plastic Man lettering looks like plastic. And the Flash lettering, of course, is moving in speed. Sergeant Rock looks like, the actual lettering on, Army uniforms and so on. But let's look at this one particular Schnapp logo for Hawkman. I happen to like this one. It has a kind of a regal, stately feel to it. Here's the cover that it comes from. It's another Jack Adler, beautiful wash over our next great Jew in comics, and that would be Joe Kubert. Joe Kubert, who starts out at DC Comics, just like Eli Katz, as a teenager, who by the mid-40s is drawing Hawkman full-time, appearing in Flash comics. But it would be in the late 50s and all through the 60s, he would become most closely identified with the World War II sergeant character, Sergeant Rock. Now, Kubert had a soulmate writer partner, another great Jew in comics, and that would be Robert Kanigher. You can see Kanigher illustrated here by Kubert with all of his creations, not only the war characters he did with Kubert, but he wrote plenty of superhero stories as well. But there are the Combat Happy Joes of Easy Company. I think this is early 60s, but look at this cover in 1968, appearing in the summer of 68. Now remember, this is a World War II character. But this idea of stopping the war, I want to get out, this is happening at the same time that we're seeing images like this from the counterculture protest movement in 1968. And then look at this story in 1971. I stopped the enemy, Rock. None of them got away, but they were civilians. This is 2 years after the story that Kanigher, obviously based on the 1969 My Lai massacre. But this story was so groundbreaking that New York Times Magazine did a feature of it. The same year, a little later, Kanigher and Kubert do this story in the pages of their feature, The Unknown Soldier, in a book called Star Spangled War Stories. Now, notice there's nothing overtly Jewish about the characters beyond the barbed curtain. They're, in a sense, generic. But this is the first story that I could find where Kubert has his characters coming upon real life Jewish situation. And it ends with the unknown soldier grasping a Jewish star. And again, I'm almost positive this could be the first appearance of overt Judaism in a DC Comics story. There's Kubert in the, I think, early 70s, maybe. Now, we haven't talked at all about what was happening with those underground cartoonists. Take Art Spiegelman, for instance. Art Spiegelman was a peer of Robert Crumb in San Francisco in those early years, in the mid to late 60s. In fact, look at how Crumb draws Spiegelman in this promotional piece. Now, if you really want to get a foundation in Spiegelman's work, you got to get his collection called Breakdowns, which shows the range of Spiegelman's comics work, which is very graphic, very meta, works on many levels. But he could go from the diagrammatic, analytical comics like this page, almost abstract, 1973, and then he could do genre material with a kind of a modern twist like Ace Hole Midget Detective. But it was this 1972 story, appearing a year after Kubert reveals that Jewish star, we get one of the greatest autobiographical stories in comic history by Spiegelman called Prisoner on the Hell Planet, in which he tells the story of how his mother committed suicide and he was in a mental institution for months. And he was told that his mother was dead after, he got out of the mental institution. And you can see in these powerful graphic panels, Spiegelman, he's a bit of a chameleon as an artist. He bends his style to fit the material. And I apologize, I wish I had better resolution versions, but you can see how Spiegelman is referring to the guilt that he felt over him being the cause in others' eyes by being a lost soul in a mental institution that his mother committed suicide. And look at the last panel. I remember the last time I saw her, Artie. She came into my rooms late at night. You still love me, don't you? I turned away, resentful of the way she tightened the umbilical cord. Sure, Ma. Ag. Well, Mom, if you're listening, congratulations. You've committed the perfect crime. You put me here, shorted all my circuits, cut my nerve endings, and crossed my wires. You murdered me, Mommy, and you left me here to take the rap. Pipe down, Max. Some of us are trying to sleep. That wasn't Spiegelman's only 1972 underground comic story with his overtly Jewish theme in it. But he would take this classic image and concept and turn it into this iconic image. Yes, folks, it's the short 1972 story, Mouse, that would become the foundation of Spiegelman's masterwork. When I was a young mouse in Rego Park, my papa used to tell me bedtime stories about life in the old country during the war. So yes, Spiegelman is a child of Holocaust survivors. And you can see that Spiegelman decides, in a kind of a mock Disney meta take, to turn it into a funny animal story where the Jews are mice and the Nazis are cats. Now, remember, at the same time, Crumb is doing Fritz the Cat, so who knows if that was an influence, but that was Spiegelman's genius. And to some of his critics, you know, who don't like Mouse, they point to the fact that he anthropomorphized it. So this appears in 1972, and as we'll see later, becomes the foundation for his Mouse masterwork a decade or so later. The next time we would see a Nazi helmet in comics would be this image from, yes, DC Comics. From, yes, Joe Kubert and his partner, Bob Kanigher. Kubert just did the covers. But yes, it was stories of World War II as seen through Nazi eyes. Are you kidding me? Yes. Now I'm showing you these issues out of order to make a point. Look at issue 2. Remember the other crowd scene? Nobody was overtly Jewish. Notice on this cover, he's got them both in yarmulkes. And it turns out this story in this issue is a graphic version of the raid on the Warsaw Ghetto. The illustrator is Rick Estrada. But you can see in these panels of this one page how Kanigher, the writer, probably did his research, and these were probably some of the things the Germans actually said. They die like flies, a weak people. They are unfit to live. Yeah, that's how they thought of the Jews. They were like vermin that needed to be cleaned up. Check out this page. Here, let's start at the top. It's all about a inmate from one of the camps who's let out by one of the German soldiers with a conscience to tell the world of what was happening. That image of dead, naked bodies is the only thing I've ever seen which attempts to illustrate the reality of when you opened up that gas chamber. Everybody was naked, and because there was a little hole at the top where the gas came in, everybody clawing and scratching their way over each other to get to that little hole. So not only did these people die horribly, but they literally died. When you say like dogs, even worse than dogs, but they literally died clawing each other to death as they were gasping for air. And only DC Comics and Kanigher and Kubert had the balls to picture this. Look at how the old man evokes Masada. Look at how this last panel here recalls the famous photograph of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. There were only 5 issues of Blitzkrieg with similar stories. Kubert did all the covers. But man, they didn't shy away with also, you know, showing that they didn't show the well, I can't get into a whole thing about Blitzkrieg, but yeah, that was the last issue. Here's actually the first issue that appeared in early 1976. Later that year, in 76, Kubert and Kanigher would deliver this odd character, Ragman, which would have a kind of a not overt Jewish background, but to everybody reading it, it takes place in the rag trade, as it's called. Schmatas is the Yiddish word. But according to the origin story, all of Rory's father's World War II mates all had special powers, and they get tangled up in electrical cables by the mob. Don't even ask me what the setup for this was, but with the power of electricity and by touching hands, he somehow gains all the powers of all of his father's World War II buddies. And along with a costume left for him, don't even ask me, he's got a circus background, he becomes essentially Kubert and Kanigher's take on Batman. And Ragman, who only appeared for a handful of issues in 76 and 77, would later be revived at DC Comics, and his Jewish background would be much more a part of his origin. You can see here in an issue in the 1980s, I believe, that they set the Ragman origin story right in Auschwitz. So here's another issue from 1976 or maybe 77. And it was in 76 that in the underground comic world, you got this very Jewish comic book, because its creator is our next great Jew in comics, and that would be Harvey Pekar, who puts out a black and white magazine called American Splendor in 1976. What makes this pretty revolutionary is that all the stories were, of course, written by Harvey Pekar, who was a writer living in Cleveland, working in a civil service job, but he was a child of pop culture. He wrote jazz reviews, record reviews, and loved comics. And he befriended Robert Crumb, who was fascinated with Pekar's short stories of random incidents in his life, and agreed magnanimously, because remember, Crumb is already super famous by the 70s. But he was able to give Pekar's fledgling title his stamp of approval by illustrating these stories, which again, on a meta level, very modern, just had Pekar addressing the audience directly. And I think that's what fascinated Crumb, was the realism, the stark reality, the humanism, the pathos in Harvey Pekar's own life, which, you know, as they say, an unexamined life is not worth living. Pekar's examining his life, and he's getting Robert Crumb to draw it. Now, he also got other artists to draw for him. Gary Dumm, this might be. Over all the years, he worked with a coterie of artists, all different styles, but all telling Pekar's stories about people in his life, events, other people that he worked with at his civil service job. You can see all the different art styles, but man, it was always Crumb. Almost every issue, Crumb would do something. But here's just a story about one of the guys Pekar works with. So you can get a sense, again, there's a very Jewishiness about these very plain, simple, everyday stories. Again, getting back to the Sholem Aleichem and Isaac Bashevis Singer and writers like that. And you can feel the passion in Pekar's character as drawn by Crumb in single page images like this. And I think he drew most of the covers, Crumb, which again, always gave American Splendor that kind of seal of professionalism that Crumb brought to it. Now, at the same time Pekar is putting out American Splendor, you have Will Eisner, remember him? By the 70s, he's licensing his old Spirit stories out to be reprinted by Warren Comics, which published black and white magazines, mostly horror. But the Spirit coming out in 1974 was a change of pace. So Eisner is aware of what's happening in underground comics. He's seeing American Splendor and Art Spiegelman and Robert Crumb. And while he's still drawing spirit images in his classic Nobody Drew Rain Like Eisner, real rain fell into his life when in the early 70s, and folks, most of us found this out decades later, but his teenage daughter, his only daughter, dies, I think, of leukemia. I might be wrong about that, but it's a tragedy in Eisner and his wife's life. And it took him a few years, but he channeled that tragedy cathartically in what would become his magnum opus, really, although I consider The Spirit his masterworks. But in terms of the graphic novels that he really kind of put on the map in 1978 with A Contract with God. This is obviously a later edition, but I wanted to keep the range ripping theme because it's not really a graphic novel. It's actually a series of short stories set in and around the New York that he grew up in. But this first story, The Contract with God, is about the day Frimmy Hirsch buried Rachel, his daughter. Again, the realism mixed with the cartooniness is Eisner's hallmark. But here's a rabbi having a dialogue with God, very Job-like. If God requires that men honor their agreements, then is not God also so obligated? And here's God's answer, the thunder crackling at the window. And that's why that evening on the stoop of the tenement, Shloimi Krex signed his name below that of Frimmy Hirsch, thereby entering into a contract with God. The other stories in the Contract with God graphic novel all deal with Eisner looking back on his very Jewish life in the tenements of New York where he grew up. You can see in this photograph how pretty accurate Eisner's drawing was. A kukkaline, if I'm even pronouncing that right, is like a neighborhood block party where everybody in the tenements would get together and have a kukkaline. So this is the kind of Jewishness that Eisner imbued into these stories. He would later collect all of his post-Contract with God stories that centered on the city in New York in a collection that would come out in the 80s, New York, the big city. But you can see his approach here is literally to let the picture often tell the story through his incredible eye for detail and that great combination of realism and cartooniness. You can see that he's really imbuing life into lifeless structures. One of Eisner's hallmarks, I think. The sights, the smells of the city. Eisner, both the master cartoonist and the realist at the same time. Again, look at how he's using the city window device as a metaphor for the comic book panels of a comic book page, which at the same time, our friend Art Spiegelman in 1980, while Eisner is doing these city stories, Spiegelman founds Raw magazine, which is really about trying to print cutting edge underground comics from both America and Europe. And he would go on through the 80s to introduce a whole range of new great comic cartoonists. But he also decided to serialize Mouse from being that little short story from 1972 into a bigger graphic novel, probably influenced by Eisner. He would collect the first volume in 1986. And so much of the graphic novel was as much about how he would work in the modern era with his adult father reminiscing, and then go into flashbacks as his father would tell the stories. But it was really what made, to me, Mouse sing as a graphic novel is this equally great story of both the tragedy of the Holocaust that he's recalling and his modern life as a child of a Holocaust survivor. So this is coming out in the 80s. This is influencing another New York Jew cartoonist named Ben Katcher, who you can see in his drawings of buildings out cartoons Eisner and overtly imbues Judaism into his stories of kind of an old New York. This is one of his most current graphic novels called The Dairy Restaurant, all about these early 20th century dairy restaurants that used to flood New York City that are no longer around. And that's Ben Katcher, of course. I think he was born maybe in Brooklyn or raised in Manhattan, or maybe he was raised in Manhattan. I'm not sure, but not important. But he really decided in the early 80s to really follow his muse, because he was always attracted to lower New York and the old early 20th century landmarks and streets and buildings that are no longer there. And he chose to tell these stories through his doppelganger character, Julius. Now it's either Nipple or Knipple, like Knish, but very Jewish character name, a real estate photographer. That's his camera in that little packet on his back, like a backpack. Now, I would call Catcher an acquired taste, but man, if you know New York City and the Lower East Side and the old buildings and the old products, you can almost smell the kind of nostalgia that emanates from Catcher's pages. His buildings, drawn freehand, there's no rulers, yet have a solidity to them. And when you look at real buildings in downtown New York, you can see how Catcher has been able to capture them in his cartooning. He truly is the Jew of New York, as he called one of his collections. So during the 80s, all this newness is happening. Jews are coming out and being overt about their Jewishness. So all this creativity is ping-ponging back and forth between independent cartoonists like Catcher and Spiegelman and the old guard like Eisner. He decides to do a graphic novel called Fagin the Jew, which is the story of Dickens' Oliver Twist villain, Fagin, but told from Fagin's point of view, which is a very modern meta way. Anyway, it's one of his last graphic novels before Eisner passes away in 2005, but not after he created a body of work, not only The Spirit, which I believe is his masterpiece, but everything that flowed after Contract with God that made him, in the eyes of the former publisher of DC Comics, Paul Levitz, to create a couple of years ago a coffee table tome positing Will Eisner's champion of the graphic novel. The graphic novel he was working on when he died, I think he just finished it, is one of his ultimate Jewish stories. It's a kind of a docucomic about the origin of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which are these infamous anti-Semitic tracts that are still being distributed among anti-Semites of every stripe today. They were a foundation of anti-Jewish pogroms. They started by the Tsar's secret police to blame the rise of communism on Jews. So they concocted this idea that these elders of Zion were plotting to take over the world. You've heard about the Jewish bankers and all the theories. Jewish space lasers comes out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You can see in this one page Eisner's style in bringing the story of the Protocols and how they discovered after World War II ended that, of course, Goebbels used the Protocols in his anti-Jewish propaganda of hate. The same year Eisner dies, another kind of Jewish book gets translated into graphic form by Philadelphia-based artist J.T. Waldman. He takes the biblical book of Esther, which is read during the Jewish holiday of Purim, which usually occurs in March, a month before Passover. Another story about a massacre of Jews that this time is averted. But J.T. Waldman's bold and daring illustrations and layouts, his mixture of Hebrew and English in his graphics is really stunning. If you've never seen this, you should really find a copy of Megillat Esther by J.T. Waldman. He went on to illustrate some graphic novels with Harvey Pekar before Pekar passed away about 8 or 10 years ago, maybe. Not the Israel my parents promised me. Might have been Picar's last novel. He also did other graphic novels with other artists after American Splendor. Look, a story about Cleveland. But he never lost track of his Jewishness. Here's a book of Yiddishkeit, which is Yiddish for Jewish vernacular, Jewish knowledge, and how it had to work in the new land of America. Now, all these things are happening at the same time, 2005, 2003, 2006. And again, everybody, both overground and underground, are seeing what everybody else is doing. So Joe Kubert puts out Jew Gangster. What the? Yeah, it's about his growing up, just like Eisner, in, lower New York and Brooklyn, where there were Jewish gangs. Along with the mafia, there were the Irish gangs and the Jewish gangs. There were the Jew gangsters. Look at how this photograph of the elevated train, classic 1940s image of New York, Kubert works into this double page spread. I mean, that's a master at work, folks. Also, kind of like Eisner, you get a mixture of cartooniness and realism with Kubert. His brushstrokes are so expressionistic and yet very realistic at the same time. Right after I think he does Jew Gangster, Kubert drops a bomb on us with the graphic novel Yosel. Yosel posits the idea that what if Kubert himself had never escaped Poland in the late 30s with his family to come to America? What if he had stayed in Poland as a child and been trapped in the Warsaw Ghetto? And Kubert uses pencil illustrations to illustrate this incredible story. And it's some of Kubert's greatest work, because I think the distressed and simple graphic style of the pencils gets across the kind of harshness of their situation. And where do they, of course, all wind up? In this beautiful sepia tone illustration that Kubert does at around the same time as Yosel. And this, of course, ping-pongs to an independent cartoonist, Dave Sim, who in 2006, Dave Sim's not Jewish. He puts out Judenhass, which means Jew hatred. Look at the top. Aardvark Vanaheim presents from the creator of Cerebus. What was Cerebus? Cerebus was Dave Sim's independent comic from 1977 to 2004, 300 issues, about the life and times of an aardvark, a kind of a cross between Conan the Barbarian, and Hanna-Barbera. You get the realism of his backgrounds and his architecture with the kind of cartooniness of the sword-wielding Cerebus. Don't even ask me to explain to you the stories, but Cerebus is what we call sui generis. It's unique. You've just got to get a hold of some of his many graphic novels, like High Society, if you want to know what Cerebus was really about. But the reason why I'm showing you this is that this is what Dave Sim brought to the table when he does Judenhass in 2006, 2 years after Cerebus is finished. He says, the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 2005 made me think that every creative person should consider doing a work addressing the Shoah, the preferred Judaic term for the Holocaust, at some point in his or her life. And it seems to me that this is nowhere truer than here in the comic book field, which was created, developed, and built primarily by Jews, painstakingly, one comic book at a time, beginning in the 1930s when Jew hatred was about to manifest itself in one of the greatest, if not the greatest, atrocities ever committed by man against mankind. And Sim goes on to tell us the story of the Holocaust as he sees it. working from archival photographs that we've all seen before of the horrors of the camps. He tells of the propaganda that backed up the concept and just beautifully illustrates the horrors of the concentration camp experience. And he ends with an evocation of all the creators we've been talking about in tonight's webinar. Joe Simon, Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, and down, Joe Shuster, Siegel, Eisner, Bob Kane, and yes, who do we see down there? But Max Gaines, nee Ginzburg, who I started out this webinar as the first great Jew in comics. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this webinar, Jews in Comics, a Past and Present History. As a PS, if you're wondering where this character comes from, I created him 20 years ago during the Second Intifada. Captain Israel, a superhero for a time. I figure if two Jews can create Captain America, what can I do to help Israel? I'll create a superhero for them. And maybe through comics, they can tell Israel's point of view, which was being horribly distorted by the American press at the time. So here's my origin. When disaffected American Jew Michael David became a victim of a suicide bombing in Israel, his life was miraculously saved when an Israeli scientist transformed the shrapnel lodged in his brain with an experimental microchip, cybergenetically enhancing David's physical and mental abilities 1,000-fold. Armed with the strength of Samson and the mind of Einstein, David, spiritually reborn, strives for the wisdom of Solomon as Captain Israel, fighting the scourges of terrorism and anti-Semitism as he guards the lives, laws, and way of life of Israelis and Jews worldwide. Well, the first issue I did with this pro-Israel organization based in LA called Stand With Us was just an 8-pager telling the story with Captain Israel as a kind of a narrator of how Israel came to be formed, with a lot of knowledge that a lot of people don't realize, like the fact that Palestine, the name, was created by the Romans after they kicked out all the Jews after the Jewish wars. And as an insult, named the land, which was called Judah and Israel, but named it Palestine, named after their biblical enemies, the Philistines. Remember David and Goliath? And then up into the modern era about how the Jewish settlers came from anti-Semitic pogroms in Europe and Russia in the 19th century. They were the early settlers. Up into the 20th century and Theodore Herzl and the creation of the state of Israel with the help of the British government. And then into the modern era, post-1967, Six-Day War. This might be the only pro-Israel army image ever created. And what was I thinking? I was just thinking of every Jack Kirby World War II image I could think of when doing my Captain Israel image. When this came out in 2010, I think, it was covered in the Israeli press. Here it is in Hebrew, and the Jerusalem Post covered it in English. Well, this was like I said, where's their date? 2011, so 11 years ago. Well, just recently, somebody, an artist named Sarai Gavati, if I'm pronouncing that right, creates this Israeli superhero, Iron Dome, the protector, defender of Israel. So, ladies and gentlemen, when I say Jews in Comics, a past and present history, it's present, man. So thanks again for being here. If you go to my website, folks, arlenschumer.com, you can go to separate pages, like my page on comic book history, which shows you my hardcover coffee table book about comic book art history in the 1960s. It's the only book of its kind that features the artwork. I even take out the original word balloons and put the artist talking about the art. I run a couple Facebook groups that you could friend me and come join. one on the Silver Age, one on just Jack Kirby's work, and one on the artist who influenced me the most and probably a whole generation, Neil Adams. If you look at my own illustration style, one of my specialties is turning people into superheroes and keeping the photographic likeness. I'm also hooked up through my website to the merchandising site, TeePublic, where you can get over 125 of my illustrations in everything from t-shirts to posters to you name it. My visual lectures and webinars page, I used to call what I did live before the pandemic visual lectures because, as you can see, I'm very visual. But you can link to my YouTube channel and my Vimeo channel where videos of all of my recent webinars and my older live lectures are housed. The most current ones are the webinars I've been doing the last 2 years. If you scroll down, you'll be able to find, yes, I'm an equal opportunity lecturer. I also do a lecture on Christ in comics. Remember, it's Jews and comics, and it's Christ in comics. So a video of that webinar is on my YouTube channel. If you go to my Vimeo channel, there are webinars with copyrighted material that YouTube's lawyers flag, but Vimeo's lawyers don't. So you can see 19 webinars are on there of a great variety of pop culture material. Coming up next week, I'll be doing a webinar on the great Doc Savage paperback paintings of James Bama and showing you the source reference photograph for each cover. That's April 30th, I believe. And then next week, no, April 27th. And then the first week of May, these are all Wednesdays, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Because May was the date month of the first Batman, why not Bill Finger, the man who made Batman, Batman? And then one of Batman's biggest influences, a week later, if all goes well, I'll be doing the greatest version of The Shadow in comic form by Michael Kaluta. And keeping with the pulp theme, I'll probably end May with, yes, the Green Hornet TV series webinar featuring Bruce Lee as Kato in the background. So folks, if you go to my events blog page, I always post my comings and goings with all the links you need to join. So thanks again, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for some of the tech snafus, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.